Hello, everyone. I am April Chapman, and welcome to the Standard of Truth podcast. Today, I have a very special edition of the show, and I have an outstanding guest that will be joining me. It's funny because I discovered today's guest about a year ago on Rumble. Of all places, I stumbled across this gentleman on Rumble, and I've been following him ever since. And then a few months ago, I was invited to a private roundtable discussion hosted by former Georgia Senator Kelly Loeffler. And not knowing who was going to be in attendance other than who invited me, I actually saw him sitting across the room. And I'm like, that's the guy I've been following on Rumble. It's very weird and cool at the same time to meet people who you've only known from watching on social media. And I had no idea that he actually lived right here in the same town where I live. So, as many of you know, I am a political and social conservative, but I am this way because what I think about the world and the issues of today stem solely from my biblical worldview. So, as a Christian, I live in the world, but I am not of this world. However, while I'm still here living in the world, I do want to know what's going on in the world. Well, my guest today is an awesome communicator, and he has a way of pulling out the most brilliant observations from political and social issues that most people tend to miss. So, today, we're going to talk about everything from the beef between leftists and conservatives, affirmative action, our current president, Joe Biden, identity politics, personal responsibility, and more. So, without further ado, please welcome to the show political commentator and real estate investor, Mr. Rob Lett.
Yeah. How you doing, April?
I am doing well. Welcome to the show, Rob. I've been following you for a while, and I'm so excited to introduce my audience to you and to your content. Now, you and I are both originally from the same city. You're from New York City, and I'm from New York as well. And now we currently live in the same city, which is super cool. But in case anyone hasn't noticed, you are a black man, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
you're black and you're conservative. And I too, I am a black woman and I am conservative as well. But you've been conservative way longer than I have been. So I'm interested in hearing you tell the audience, what was it that caused you to end up on this side of the political spectrum and to vote for former President George Bush all those years ago? Give us a little insight into your political journey.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned, I'm originally from New York. So I grew up, just to give some perspective, I did a keynote talk and I explained this to them too, just to give you some perspective of the part of New York where I grew up. If you are familiar with any of the old school rappers, the Run DMCs, the LL Cool J, I went to high school with the guy who invented FUBU. Okay, I went to high school with Damon John. He and I were in the same gym class. Used to slap box and everything. Okay, who 50 Cent was from Jamaica, Queens. All right, so I grew up in that era. So to say that I grew up in a conservative neighborhood is far from the truth, right? My parents were both Democrats. I remember when Jesse Jackson was what everyone thought he was going to be the first black president, and my dad was ecstatic, right? My dad was getting ready to get the bullhorn and all that stuff. And so how I ended up being conservative is a weird thing because my parents are real estate investors. They did that part time. They weren't full time real estate investors. My dad was in air conditioning and refrigeration. My mom was a nurse. But I had an interest in real estate because we lived in a 3-level house, and all around me, my whole life, I'd been surrounded by tenants. And so it wasn't until one day my dad pulls up in this 420 Mercedes Benz that I was like, hey, how'd you get that? Because we're a middle class family. We did not come from money. And that's when the conversation started about this real estate investing thing. And so I think what spurred my interest in conservatism was when I really took an interest in business. And I remember very clearly when I first had the conversation with myself, I'm an only child, so I talk to myself a lot, right? So I remember specifically being in my room, and I was about to graduate from high school, and I remember having the conversation and saying, "Wow, I am about to be my own man, and what does that mean?" And I remember thinking to myself, "I don't even know, am I a Democrat or am I a Republican?" And I thought to myself very clear in that moment. I said, I think I'm a Republican because I believe Democrats are full of it. And the reason I
Really?
said that, yep, I said this in high school. And the reason I said that is because I noticed that Democrats always tried to make people feel bad about being successful, or feel bad about being rich. And I said, that's inconsistent to me because those politicians are rich and trying to make you feel guilty about the very thing they are pursuing themselves. And I said, at least with the Republicans, they're honest about it. They're like, we ain't apologizing for being rich. Ain't no reason for us to apologize. And so between that and taxes, keeping more of your money, I suspected back then that I was probably a Republican. But I used the word suspected because I didn't really know what that meant. Only thing I knew was from a finance perspective, they looked like they were at least the ones honest from a business perspective. And so it's real estate investing that actually opened the door to me later becoming more and more conservative because eventually I did take a real estate seminar and I ended up buying a bunch of properties. At my height, I owned over $2 million worth of real estate. I acquired properties, managed them, all that kind of stuff. And it was having conversations with my friends that made me realize my views must have been changing because occasionally when you manage properties, you got to evict people, right? And then
Mhm.
that's when some of my friends will be like, "Oh, how could you do that?" And so I'd be like, "What do you mean? How can I do that?" And so I used to tease them being sarcastic. And I said, "Well, if you feel that strongly about it, you can give me the money and that they would pay, and I'll pay my mortgage, and we can save the world together, right?" I'll be
Yeah.
sarcastic, I'll be sarcastic with them. And so that's when I realized that occasionally my friends and I would bump heads, but it would only be over the world of finance. And so I figured
Mhm.
maybe I still didn't tie it to politics. I thought maybe it was because I was further along in my business education than they were. And so I understood things that they just didn't know. And somewhere along the line, I just started realizing that there were a lot of things in business that I disagree with them about. And somewhere along the line, I stumbled across this guy named Milton Friedman, an economist that I saw on YouTube. And I started watching his videos. And I was impressed by the fact that he never denigrated, he never spoke in derogatory terms, but he just crushed everybody with his ideas of economics and everything. And I was like, this guy, and no, it didn't matter what he talked about. If he talked about social issues, he had this view that was totally against the grain. And I was like, I like this guy. And when I realized he was a conservative, I was like, I need to understand what this means because whatever he is, that's me.
Right.
And one thing led to another. I realized uh, that Milton Friedman was actually the professor for Thomas Sowell, and then I learned who Thomas Sowell was, and then I was all in. So, but it was so crazy. But I really just jumped the gun because I talked about when I realized I was a conservative. But before then, remember I said right after high school, I suspected I was a conservative, but I didn't know what it meant.
Right.
And so I still voted like most people vote. I voted for the guy who sounded impressive, but I didn't know what he was really saying. And so I voted for Bill Clinton 2 times because I was impressed with his words and then playing the saxophone and all this stuff. And then once I really analyzed what he was saying, I was like, holy crap, don't need to do that anymore. And that is when, by the time George Bush came along, I was like, I know one thing, blacks are going in the wrong direction, and I'm playing a role in this nonsense, so I need to put an end to it. Still didn't understand exactly what I was doing, but I knew I need to put an end to it.
Wait a minute. So when you say that you realized when you were considering voting for George W. Bush that you felt that black folks were going in the wrong direction. Can you expound on that in terms of what did you mean by that? Because I distinctly remember this time in history where Bill Clinton was the president and black people in mass were enamored by him because it was like, well, he plays the saxophone. Like, that's really our first black president. Like, he just seemed so, down with the people. But none of us, at least I know from my perspective, I could not articulate policies that he actually advocated that were good for
Mhm.
Black people. Can you take us back to that time where you started noticing that we were going in the wrong direction? What did you mean when you said that?
Not specifically Bill Clinton, but Democrat
Okay.
policies in general. I'll give you an example. One of my huge pet peeves is the minimum wage. Okay.
Okay.
I was invited by a Democrat friend of mine to be on a Zoom call once, and he says, "Rob, I promise you, I'm not inviting you to set you up or whatever it is, but you're the only friend I know that thinks like this or whatever." So I get on the call, and that was one of the things they allowed me to bring up, is I talked about the minimum wage, and I said, all of you guys are for advocates for the minimum wage, and you don't even know the history of the minimum wage and
Mm.
how that is used to actually oppress Black people. And they said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "If you will look up, there's a document, and it's still out there for download. It's a document called The Economic Theory of a Legal Minimum Wage. It's by a British socialist named Sidney Webb, and it will explain to you why the minimum wage came to be in the first place. Because prior to the minimum wage, prior to FDR, and old school Blacks, you still hear them talk like this. Old school Blacks were taught that if you want to succeed, learn a trade, learn skills with your hands. Plumber. That's why you heard me mention that my dad was in air conditioning and refrigeration, plumbing, electrician, right? All of these things use your hands. They said as long as you have these skills, you will never go hungry, because someone always needs something done, right?
Right.
And so remember that during the Depression, 1929, right? What happened was everybody was poor. White people were poor, people with resumes, all this advanced education, etc.,
Mhm.
and they were out of work,
Right.
except for Black people, because of
Mm.
this. And that didn't go well with white people. White people was like, hold on a second. There's Black people out here with a job, and they're feeding their family, and I can't feed my family. And how dare, we go to the politicians, we got to do something about this. You can't pay that Black person this, and I'm out here struggling. And so they lobbied to pass something called the minimum wage law. And let me give a brief understanding so people can understand how economics works.
Right.
when you want when you want to encourage someone to buy something, you lower the price. When
Mhm.
you want to discourage someone from buying something, you raise the price. So when someone tells you that we need to set a cap, we need to set a certain amount, a ceiling of what the wage should be, what they are doing is, especially now we're at like $15 an hour, the more someone mandates a high wage, what you are really doing is you are raising the cost of labor. Therefore, you are discouraging certain amounts of people who fall below that. This is the this is this is the problem. So the beauty of here's a perfect example. Here's a perfect example. Everyone can relate to this. In 2008, okay, in 2008, what everyone witnessed for the first time, people who went through a real estate crash here. I'm coming current to go back. What happened is when the crash occurred, we saw all sorts of very educated people, right? All of a sudden having to take jobs at McDonald's, all of a sudden having to deliver pizzas, right? So
Right.
put yourself in the mind of an employer for a second. If the minimum wage, it wasn't the minimum wage back in 2008, but let's just say for argument's sake, if the minimum wage was $15 an hour, put yourself in an employer's mindset. If by law I have to pay someone $15 an hour, who am I going to pay? Am I going to pay this uneducated teenager who I have to keep them reminding them to stay off the telephone, stay off Snapchat, stay off this, show up on time? Would I pay that person, or would I pay this guy over here who's got advanced degrees, who already knows how to show up on time, who can communicate? They got all of these skills for $15 an hour. Who are they going to hire? They're going to hire the person with the advanced degrees, and they're not going to hire the other person. So
Right.
what they just did is they've discouraged that employer, even though economically it would make sense for them to hire them. By law, they can't.
Mm.
This is the reason why Blacks And the unemployment rate for teenagers have always been higher than the average unemployment rate because they don't have the education. So white people purposely put a, a price on the wage that discouraged you from looking at anyone who is uneducated. The employer would be like, heck no, it's a no-brainer. But if you had removed that minimum wage law, then what
Mhm.
happens is the employer says, you know what, you don't have the education, but it's a trade-off.
Right.
It's a trade-off. I'm going to save, you're going to learn. This is going to be sort of an internship. I can deal with that because you're saving me something. But if I got to pay $15 an hour, I don't have time to train you on all this stuff too. And
Right.
so black people don't realize that has been the biggest cause of our poverty is the minimum wage law, and you can't get even educated black people to realize that.
That is very true. I think from our perspective, we look at it and we consider ourselves, we're like, "Oh, well, using the term virtue signal. It's like, well, it's altruistic to want to pay people more, a livable wage, but they don't understand the implications of paying something like that, what it means in the grand scheme of things. So on
Mhm.
one end, they consider themselves, well, I'm socially better than you because I want to actually pay people more, but they don't realize that it's actually hurting people at the lower end of the wage spectrum. Is that what you're essentially saying?
Yeah, it's hurting people. To give you a real world perspective of something else that I did once, one time I used to run a big office in Atlanta where I trained salespeople about real estate education. And at some point, I came up with this bright idea that I wanted to try different types of marketing. And so, if you've ever seen those people who stand on the corner and they hold the signs and they're twirling the signs and all that kind of stuff, I
Yes.
said, I wonder how much traffic would I get if I hired someone to hold one of my signs up. And I've never done it before. And at the time, I don't remember what year this was, but the economy was a little tight. So I didn't have a lot of money to experiment on this. But I sat down and ran the numbers, and I probably had $100 or something that I can throw at it and just do a test for one day. And so I started running the numbers as to what I could pay. Like I said, it was $100, but I don't remember what it equated to per hour, but I hadn't really thought it through. And so it ended up being something that was going to be less than the minimum wage, but I hadn't really calculated it like that. Anyway, I ran a Craigslist ad looking for someone who holds signs, and immediately I got a response from someone all ticked off. They're like, "How can you? What you're doing is illegal. You can't do this. It's beneath the minimum wage." And I was like, "Dang, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to be breaking the law." I hadn't thought about it like that. But it just so happened right around the same time that somebody was chewing me out, another person responded, and she wanted the job. And so I was like, okay, great. So I'll just take her. I'll just take her. I met her at this Kinko's on Barrett Parkway down there. We sat down, and I remember she was in this rent by the week motel with her husband and everything. It was a bad situation. She didn't even have her own cell phone. Like her husband had the cell phone and all this stuff. And I sat back and I thought about this, and this is what I explained on the Zoom call. And I said, here's what I want all of you to know, you bleeding heart leftists, is you say you care so much about poor people. Do you realize that this lady doesn't have her own cell phone? She doesn't have her own transportation. She doesn't have income. That's why she responded to the ad. But what you are telling me is the people who care so much about homelessness, you are telling me that I can't hire her because it's against the law. I'm here to help. I'm here to help. There's a woman in
Right.
need right there in front of me, and you're telling me that I'm breaking the law. So you tell me which one of us is the criminal here.
Right.
This is capitalism. I have a I have a need for something, a service to that I there's a service that I want someone to provide for me. She's willing. There's two people. We don't need a third party in here, but the government steps in to tell me I'm breaking the law. Why is
Right.
this any of your business? That is keeping her poor.
So let
That
me ask, okay, and to play devil's advocate though, what would you say to someone that says, "Well, I hear what you're saying, but it seems exploitative to me because you had one person who didn't want to do the job and claimed that, the wage was too low and that was against the law. and then you have the actual individuals that are like, listen, I need that $100. How would you respond to them to say you're exploiting this young woman's situation by trying to pay her this wage, knowing that it's not enough?
You know, it's so funny. Every time I hear someone say that it's exploitive, it's always from a third party who's none of their business in the beginning, to none of their business from the start. The
Right.
woman responded to me. It's not like I was going to track her down and say, "You're going to do this." No, she responded of her own volition. It's voluntary. This is the reason why my next show is I'm doing a show called "The Real Reason Why Democrats Hate Capitalism." Capitalism is voluntary. This is what people don't get. Capitalism is a voluntary exchange. Okay. So when people say it's exploitive, I'm like, how? It's not slavery. It's not like I went to the lady's hotel and pulled her out and made her say, "You're going to do this." She had to get on a computer somewhere. She had to realize she had a need somewhere. We talked. Does this work for you? Yes. Great. We got two willing people. That's not exploitation. And the funny thing is, too, when people tell me, "Oh, that wage is it's exploitive," and I say, "Let me ask you something," and I'll say, "Do you make the minimum wage now?" And it'd always be some hoity-toity person with some high degree, and they'd be like, "No," and I was like, "What do you make now?" "Oh, I make six figures." Blah 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 blah. I said, "Did you always make six figures?" "No, I didn't." "Oh, so at some point you worked at McDonald's, and because even though it wasn't necessarily the wage you wanted, you needed that to establish some work history, some responsibilities. You needed to be able to get some skills like showing up on time, all of these different things. And eventually that increased your skill in the marketplace. And then you escalated from there, but you needed to have your foot in the door somewhere so that you
Mm.
could learn skills. What you are denying people, but you call it being exploitive, you are denying people the ability to put their foot in the door.
Right. So essentially, you're saying that those jobs where normally younger people, unskilled people would want to take that job so that they one can get some semblance of a work history, that they could actually learn or develop a healthy doctrine of work at the lower end. Employers are now looking past those people and are saying, well, since you're forcing me to pay $15 an hour, the job that I'm offering doesn't require the skill set for that is really not worth it. So I'm just going to get the best bang for my buck and hire someone that I don't have to train. And is that the argument? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody is like, well, if I'm going to pay that, I may as well get this kind of caliber for it. I'm not going to pay $15. I mean, you wouldn't pay. I mean, use that analogy on anything. You're not going to pay extravagant prices. You're not going to pay $500, $600 a night for you to stay in a Ramada Inn.
No.
You see what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? That works with everything. You're not going to overpay and get lackluster for it. If you're going to be paying something ridiculous anyway, then get the best. But it's the law that's doing that, and that's what people don't understand. That's not capitalism. I see so. It's part of the reason why I'm making a show on capitalism is because I see so many people that they come up with this negative perception of, well, that's capitalism. No, it's not. Capitalism is voluntary exchanges. What you're describing is the government butting their nose in where they don't belong. This is supposed to be a two-party transaction. The government is the third party telling me that I'm exploiting and by law I have to do this. I don't want to pay that rate. She didn't ask to be paid that rate. You're the only person here that has absolutely nothing to do with the transaction.
Ah, interesting. So since we've talked a little bit about capitalism and we've discussed your journey. Your journey was more of an economic journey into why you found that conservatism was better than leftism. Can you explain to the audience from your perspective the categorically the differences between leftism and conservatism, like on a macro sense? Just help break it down, because a lot of people believe that it's all about money, right? And that conservatives are just these greedy, money hungry, rich people that don't want no one else to have anything, which is not true. Can you describe on a macro sense, though, from your perspective, the category differences between leftism and conservatism?
Sure. And I appreciate people thinking that way because, as I mentioned, even in my own history, that's how I started thinking. The first thing that I thought of is I'm siding with Republicans because of money, right? That was the first thing.
Right.
So I understand people thinking that way, but that's actually not true.
Okay.
The best description that I've heard, the most simplistic description I've heard, is of the late Herman Cain. Herman Cain used to say, Democrats believe, or leftists believe, in more government, less personal responsibility.
Mm.
Conservatives believe in more personal responsibility, less government. And so, to keep things at a pace where everyone can relate to it, I like to use something all of us can relate to, is being a kid. When you were a kid, couldn't you wait? You probably couldn't wait till you could move out, right? The day you could move out, you're like, man, I can't wait to move out. You probably couldn't wait till you can get that driver's license so you could drive, right? Man, I can't wait to get my car, my permit, my license. Now, here's the question: why? Why
Because
couldn't
of
you wait?
freedom.
Because of exactly, this is what people don't think of when they think, oh, Republicans. No, you didn't like the fact that your mom be like, as soon as you start putting on your clothes, your mom like, you're wearing that, I didn't even know you own that. Where are you going with that, right? Or who are you going out with? Well, I'm going out with Johnny. I hadn't met Johnny. Bring Johnny in here. You got too many questions. You just like, leave me alone, right? You want freedom, right? Same thing with the car, right? If you had took your parents' car, your parents would be like, well, I need that car. You need to bring it back by such and such time. You're like, I want my own car. You wanted freedom. This has
Right.
absolutely nothing to do with finance. This was freedom. And so that's what conservatives believe. As conservatives believe, look, let me make my own decisions. If I make a mistake, I make a mistake and let me learn from it. That's what living is, right?
Mhm.
But on the left, government is be like your parents, right? Imagine we all know that one. We all had that one friend that we hung out with, where their parents were so overbearing that we used to tease them and be like, "Man, your mom won't let you do nothing. Your dad won't
Right.
let you do nothing," right? That's the example of leftism, government, right? And if you notice, if you think back in your childhood to the house that there was always one house that all the friends hung out at. I guarantee you it wasn't that house. It wasn't
Mm.
that parent's house, right?
No.
That's the equivalent of what you see in the United States when you see everyone running from other countries to come to the United States. That's your friend's house, the United States. Right? We're like, we ain't going to be over there with that overbearing so and so always telling us what to do. I'm tired of it, man. I want to be over at Johnny's house. We can play music, we can play video games. They let us cuss sometimes, whatever it is, right? That's the two examples that I think everyone can relate to. So I always say, all of us are conservative, we just don't know it because
That
we
is
want,
very true.
yeah, we want freedom. We've been taught to work hard and just not expect something for nothing. We've been taught back in the days, if you get a girl pregnant or whatever it is, back in the day, it was just like when you get married. It wasn't even a question. It's like when you got pregnant. I know y'all about to get married. You're gonna take care of this baby.
That's
All of us are
awesome.
raised with those principles. It's only in these past 10 years or so that it's become controversial all of a sudden, for you to start, really talking about the fact that you like traditional marriages.
Right. So
Right.
it sounds like you've explained to us at the bare bones level the difference between leftism and conservatism is freedom versus government bondage.
Hmm.
And so based on what you've expressed, can you formulate why Black Americans, despite we historically already know what it's like to be in bondage, like not anyone living today, but historically we're like, listen, we were brought over here as slaves. Freedom is something that we've always wanted. Why is it that you believe that despite us having wanted freedom and the taste of freedom for so long, why, despite not getting anything in return for their vote, why do so many of us continue to vote for Democrats at a rate of over 90%? Are you able to help make it make sense? Or in your opinion, what do you think that's all about?
Well, two things. And I did a show on this too. I talked about the rise of the black conservative, and then I talked about how blacks ended up going right back into the hands of their captors in a sense.
Right.
And I think one of the problems is I equate it to when you see people get out of prison. When you see people get out of prison the first time, it's like I'm free, and then in the same breath, it's like free to do what?
Right.
Because you've been gone for so long. You've been out of you've been out of the economy. The neighborhood's changed. You don't have any skills, and so there's that. Uh, there's that to blame in terms of blacks coming out of slavery. It's like, okay, we're free, but we've always taken orders from somebody. So I don't really know what I would do if no one is telling me what to do anymore. So there's a little bit of that, not knowing what freedom really means if you've never tasted it. So that's why I said don't blame your ancestors so much, because I can understand the confusion if it's a new experience. And then on top of that, there's always the enticement of freedom. Excuse me, not freedom. I said that wrong. There's always the enticement of getting something for free. So when someone says, listen, don't worry about having to deal with, here's a perfect analogy. Here's a good analogy. Let me back up. This is a better analogy. I was watching once I was married before. I was watching once this show, and it had to do with pimps. Okay, it had to do with pimps. And the pimp on the show, guy named Bishop Don Magic Wand, he was talking to the interviewer, and he was trying to explain why a woman would give the pimp all of her money. And Bishop Don Magic Wand looks at the camera with a straight face. He says, I supply the medical, I supply the housing, I supply the clothing, the food. All she has to do is supply the money. And I looked at my wife and I said, did you hear that? I said, he said that with a straight face. I said, what idiot would fall for that? And I caught myself in mid-sentence and I said, we do. We fall for that. And she says, what do you mean? And I said, everything he said is what the government says. The government says, you want affordable housing? You want a retirement plan through Social Security? You want better schools? You want affordable health care? Oh, I'll give you all that stuff. All you have to do is supply the money, right? I mean, it's the exact same thing, right? They're hitting us with sales tax, income tax, property tax, death tax,
sales tax,
the ad valorem tax. I mean, you're getting taxable oblivion, out there oblivion, but they're paying for it all with your money. And you're thinking that you're getting it all for free. You're not getting it for free. And that is how blacks got trapped into this whole idea of actually being a child. Because in the Democrats' mind, their whole model is government is to be the parent. That's what Democrats want. That's the reason why I started off saying that Democrats believe in more government, less personal responsibility. Everything that they're pitching to you is for you to be subservient to government. They want government to replace your parent. They want government to replace your family. They want government to replace your God.
Listen, that's it.
Yep.
That's it. I've heard it before, but to have you, like you do in your true Rob Lett fashion, you simplify it in such a way that whoever is listening can think of every government program and say, you know what, yup, that it's designed to cause us to be more infantile and then to rely on them. The only difference is they're not good parents, because good parents are, we are given the charge to provide all those things and give our children the best, with the sole goal of eventually saying, okay, I've given you everything that you needed to flourish. Now it's your turn to go out in the world and do it for yourself. The difference with the government is they don't ever want to let you leave home. And then they're bad parents. They're not giving you the best. They're like the ones that know, they claim it's their responsibility to take care of you, and they tell everybody You know, that deadbeat parent that's always talking about everything that they do for the kids, and the kid is sitting there like, no, you don't. Uh-uh. That's not true. And they're like, shut up, shut up. That's the kind of parent
Right.
that the government is. So I appreciate you giving us that perspective. Now, I'm going to call on you. I need you to give our audience a little history lesson, and hopefully I'm not catching you off guard, but you've done a video called The Time When Blacks Voted Conservative. I need for you to walk us down memory lane for a bit to help the audience familiarize themselves with the time when all of us Black folks were not Democrats. So to help you, I'm gonna shoot out a few dates. You talked about back in 1936 when FDR was elected and how 77% of Blacks voted Republican.
Right.
But then you talked about how Blacks, when FDR came into play, I want to say on around 1933. I could be wrong. I'm not sure. But can you give us a history lesson as to what happened then? Why was it 77% of us were voting Republican and then something happened?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what most people, and this is perfect because this is the conversation that I have a lot of times with a lot of my Black friends that I grew up with in New York. As soon as they find out, because they grew up right across the street from me, right? They're Democrat, and they're like, Rob, what happened to you? And I'm like, what happened to me? What happened to you? Right? We go back and forth with this. And so in their view, and I'm sure you get this too, in their view, they think I'm a sellout. Their view, they think I need to explain myself. And I tell them all the time, I owe you no explanation. If anybody owes an explanation, it's you. And I say, here's the reason why. Because the Civil War, in the Civil War, people always forget that there were two sides. A war has always got two sides, right?
Right.
So if we already know that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and they were Republicans, the Union Army, then they had to be fighting somebody. So who were Republicans fighting? They were fighting the Democrat slaveholders, the ones who invented Jim Crow, the ones who started the KKK. And so when I'm sitting here having conversations with Democrats, I'm like, I owe you no explanation about how I ended up being in the party that freed me. I owe you no explanation for that. That's common sense. The person
Right.
who owes an explanation is, how did you, as a Black person, end up in the party of the KKK? You explain that to me, okay? And so how all of this happened is how Blacks were mostly Republicans because of what I just described. When Blacks looked up and was just like, holy smoke, the emancipation, we're emancipated. It was Republicans who done this. So all of a sudden, yeah, we were the party of Lincoln. If you go back, and nobody tells you this, you have to read between the lines when you watch some of these shows. But if you go back and watch some of these historical shows, you'll see Frederick Douglass, you'll see Harriet Tubman and all of them with the Union soldiers. They were Republicans back then. They don't, nowadays, mainstream media won't come out and tell you explicitly that they were Republicans. You got to figure it out. Look at the color of the uniforms or notice who's around them or whatever it is, but they were Republicans. And so, again, we were free. It's so funny to listen to some of these people nowadays, Blacks nowadays, and they're always talking about what Black people need to do. Man, we need to have our own businesses. We need to do this. We need to keep our dollars Black. And I'm like, you late to the party, dude. Republicans already done that. You keep reminiscing of the days of the Black Wall Street and reminiscing of Madam C.J. Walker and all this stuff. You forgetting this is times when Blacks were already doing it. We've lost that stuff because when FDR came in, now Blacks were like, okay, we're free. And the Democrat Party, you have to recognize the Democrat Party's position at this point. At this point, this is around the time in the 1930s, Hitler was alive still. FDR was a fan of Hitler and Mussolini. I've got a picture in that same episode that you're talking about, where in Madison Square Garden, there was 20,000 fascists that showed up, people who believed this under the same time as FDR's president. But at the same time, they were free, but then they were like, okay, we're free, but we don't really know what does that mean. Some of us were like, free to do what? And so the Democrat Party, keep in mind, they've lost the Civil War. They've been busted for having slaves. So they look like the public embarrassment to the world, not just the nation, to the world. Around this same time, Hitler has killed himself, right? We've gone in to straighten all that mess. And Democrat Party was in bed with Hitler. So now they're all identified as socialists. At this point, the Democrat Party is done. They're toast. What do? How do you rebrand yourself? You got to say, okay, we've got to offer them something. We've got to offer the people something. Otherwise, we're done as a party. And so that's when they started coming out with the New Deal. FDR comes out with all of these new benefits, and Democrats still talk about it to this day. All of the stuff that we still tolerate to this day, from unions to the minimum wage, every encroachment that we've had, big government, all got started during the FDR. And that was the first time that blacks were feeling like, hey, we're free, but we've kind of got some support from the government here. We kind of got, we don't have to feel like we're out on our own, right? And so
even though we were faring better on our own.
Exactly. And you mentioned this to me the other day, and I just watched it for the first time. You mentioned this to me about the Uncle Tom 2, and I just watched it the other day. And it was funny because there's a clip in there where one of the guys said, it's so funny. He said, you have blacks that ran their own bus companies before integration. And then all of a sudden, some black people were like, man, we want to ride on the front of a white bus. And they're like, well, we don't have any white buses. And they're like, well, we need to get on a white bus so we can get on the front of that. I mean, there was no reason for us to even be concerned about what they were doing. We already had our own. So it was only for some people the enticement of either getting support or somehow feeling like they had to be closer to white people because that was all they knew. All of those little enticements and different things that made people kind of start signing on to that. And Democrats position themselves as being in support of black causes. This is how the hijacking, by the way, this is how the hijacking of all movements. I know we're not quite down that road yet, but this is really the start of the hijacking of the movement. Because what Democrats do is they look for people who have been marginalized. They look for groups that have been marginalized. And then once they find a group that had been marginalized, they pretend to care about your cause. And I say pretend because really socialism is like a virus. I say it's like a virus because what a virus does is a virus looks for a brand new host that it can infect. And then once it infects it and then it depletes it, once you have no use for you anymore, it's off to a new host. So what it did with the Black Party or with the blacks is it was like, okay, I understand your cause. I understand you want equality. I understand that you want reparations, whatever it is you fill in the blank, we're fine. And they design all their policies like that to get you to vote for it, but it's an enticement. And so once they've got it into blacks' mindset that, oh, okay, Democrat Party is the party for me, then just like that, the Democrat Party will slap you, and before you know it, they're off to another demographic group. And so this is the reason why you hear blacks nowadays saying they're ticked off with the LGBTQ. They're like, how dare them compare their struggle with civil rights, blah, blah, blah. And blacks are like, what about me? And they're not realizing the Democrat Party don't care about you anymore. They feel like they already got you. They're off to the next demographic. And now they're saying the same thing to the LGBT community. Oh, I understand you want equality. I understand you want to be able to go into restrooms. I understand you want to be able to identify as whatever you want to. And the LGBT, I made a video for them too. I said, they're starting to realize now that they're being hijacked too. Because all of a sudden, they've taken that LGBT and they've added some other little letters on there to where they've included pedophiles and even gay people who are not for pedophilia. They're like, oh, we didn't sign up for this. But the Democrat Party did. Because the Democrat Party is like, we're here to get everybody under this umbrella that we can to get votes. We don't really care. They've hijacked movements. But wow. So I know I've gone down away from your original thing. So you were asking about, so what happened? So we started off voting mostly Republican because it was obvious. A Republican is who freed the slaves. Republican meant minimal government. And for people who are new to this, minimal government means conservatives believe government should play only about 3 roles. He should play the role of the military. That's the external protection of the United States. The police department. That's the internal protection, and the court system. That's really it. That's it. Now you think about all the other stuff that government does, and you know we're way, way beyond that. That's what gives you freedom. That's what gives you the ability to either sink or swim or become successful or whatever, but you can do it on your own, right? But that's not enough for Democrats, because Democrats think that the government should do so much more. Again, we just finished talking about the fact that governments think businesses should have say so as to how much you pay a person, right? In some states, governments they're talking about a CEO wage cap, right? How that CEO makes too much. They believe there should be laws on that. Governor Gavin Newsom just said we want to ban. They pulled back on this because they got embarrassed. But by the year 2035, they wanted to ban gasoline vehicles because they wanted to push climate change, right? To me, that is a dictator. But they shifted from, like I said, they shifted from the obvious of Republicans or how we got free to all of a sudden they're saying, yeah, we're free, but what does freedom mean? And so it was just these trinkets. It's just always been these free trinkets of different things. And I think now blacks are probably, a good number of us are starting to realize that all of these things came with a price tag and we didn't realize it.
Right. So do you think the trinkets that were provided back then, such as the Social Security, the things that came along with the New Deal, maybe back then, if you are one generation removed from slavery and you're like, we're free and it's been difficult, but a little help, if I had just a little help to get me over the hump, it might not be so bad. Do you think that maybe a lot of their reasoning was that, we just needed a little bit of help? Not all black people, right? Because there might have been some that were like, no, we struggling, but we are just fine. I'd rather struggle here independently on my own than to be on somebody's plantation where I'm being whipped and I'm given the scraps of the food, and I got to stay in this old raggedy cabin, and there's no opportunity for me to improve anything. Do you think that some, maybe they trusted a little bit too much because they felt like they needed just a little bit of help? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we trusted too much. I mean, there's always fine print, right? Democrats have always exploited the fact that people are uneducated. That's the reason
Mm,
why in slavery times they made it illegal for you to read. They've always exploited the fact that people are uneducated, right?
right.
One of the things that I've taught in my real estate seminars is I used to tell people, and I did it purposely to make them think. I would bring up a chair. I'd have a chair, and I'd say, "Let me ask you guys a question. How much does this chair pay in taxes?" And everyone would look at me confused. They'd be like, "What?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I know that's a ridiculous question because chairs don't pay taxes, right? The only thing that pays taxes in the world are human beings, right?" And they say, "Yeah." And I say, "Okay, I want you to remember that, because the next time some politician comes to you and say, we need to stick it to these rich corporations, then you should realize someone's lying to you. Because if a chair can't pay taxes, all a corporation is a stack of papers filed with the Secretary of State. So if a chair can't pay taxes, neither can a stack of papers. So somewhere in the middle, there's got to be a person behind this corporation. So when you vote to raise taxes on a corporation, what you really did is you raised taxes on somebody. Let's analyze the people that are involved in the corporation. There's the owner, there's the
Hmm.
shareholder, there are the employees, and you as a customer are on the outside. Do you think the owner's going to raise taxes on himself? Nope, probably not. So let's rule them out. Do you think the shareholders? Do you think the owner is going to let the shareholders get something raised on them? No, because the owner needs those shareholders. But there's a possibility of the employees, right? Employees could get paid less because of additional expenses, right, that they're incurring. That's a possibility, but they probably won't do that either because they need that employee to run the business. So, whereas most likely going to fall, that doggone tax increase that you just asked for to be placed on corporations, it's probably going to fall on you, the consumer. So, your dumb butt just voted for your own tax increase. And that's what I mean about Democrats exploiting people's ignorance. is they just say raise taxes on these rich people, and then you go to the polls because of envy, and you end up getting stuck with the bill, wondering why your eggs are like $20.
Right. Well, it's funny that you mentioned this because, I was educated in the New York City public school system, and I don't remember history-wise learning the vast majority of anything that you've brought up. And I'm thinking the reason why I didn't learn the things that you're mentioning is because one, the government educational system is run by the left. And so, if you keep the populace uneducated and ignorant to basic truths and facts surrounding how this country was started, how the government in the world functions, it's very easy for you to push programs such as, the New Deal or the Green New Deal or all of these other entitlements to make people think that I'm fighting for you, the little guy, when it's like, no, you're really not.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm trying to remember. I can't remember why I brought that up, but it was something that you said triggered me to be like, well, you know what? Why is it that there comes so hard for the public education system? It's because Democrats, they want to control everything, and they have to start with the educational system because if they can indoctrinate you through the K through 12 system, by the time you get out, you'll be thinking that the world works one way, but
Hmm.
then when you're out in the real world, you're like, "Wait a minute." Like the analogy that you just gave about, "Yeah, let's tax the corporation." You don't really realize that you're like, "Wait a minute. I just voted against my own interest because these corporations are not actual humans.
Hmm.
They're either disregarded entities or they're just this entity. So
Hmm.
the corporation can't. They're gonna, in order for them to pay their taxes, they've got to get that money from somewhere else, which means they're gonna pass it on to the consumer.
Right.
Thus, why our eggs are as expensive the way they are. That was a brilliant explanation. One reason why I'm glad I have you on this show is so that you can enlighten just the regular population on these things that we don't tend to think about. So with that being said, what would you say to encourage more black Americans to be more independent thinkers, or I should say, why do you believe so many of us tend to fall in line with groupthink?
Oh, this is perfect because it actually goes in line with what I do as a profession. I'm also a public speaker, and so one of the things that I meant to look up whether this is like it's a real statistic or if it's just folklore that I've heard. But someone joked that says there's a joke out there in the public speaking world that says on the list of fears, um, public speaking is number one. Most people are scared to speak. That means if it's the number one fear, then that means public speaking has got to be above death, even.
Wow.
Right? So that means people would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy.
Hmm.
Right? And so the reason why I'm answering your question is the reason why is because people don't want to stand out. They're scared to stand out. And so they much rather blend in with the group. There's something fearful in most people, of standing out because they don't want to be wrong. There's a video, uh, it's not around anymore. I've looked for it high and low, but 50 Cent, there was a great interview I saw 50 Cent once. He had just come off of this big deal that he did with vitamin water, and this woman was interviewing him, and she said, "You think you're pretty smart, huh?" And she said, "I know you made all that money with vitamin water." And I never forget his answer. He says, "No." He says, "I don't think I'm smart." He says, "I think I'm special." And she said, "Excuse me?" And he says, "You seem pretty smart." He says, "You probably went to college, right?" She says, "Yeah." And he says, "How many people were in your class? Maybe 30?" And she says, "Yeah." And he says, "Have you ever had an instructor ask a question and you knew the answer, but you didn't raise your hand?" And she says, "Yeah." And he says, "The person who raised their hand that day when you didn't, they deserve to be ahead of you in life." And she looked kind of shocked and she said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Because you knew the answer, you said it yourself. but you didn't want to raise your hand because of how you felt it would make you look. You were scared of being wrong. He says that person doesn't care about possibility of being wrong. That person doesn't care about what the other people are thinking in the room. That is life. That is living. And he says it's not, so you can't call that person smart, is what he was trying to say. You can't call that person smarter than you. You are just as smart. But that's the reason why I say I'm not smart. I'm just special. And I thought that was the best doggone interview, and I can't find it anywhere. But
So basically, he's saying I'm just special in the sense that I was willing to step out regardless of what the backlash might be, or regardless of the fact that I might fail and be totally wrong in this. I'm like, well, I'm just going to do it. Is that the takeaway that he was trying to help her understand?
yeah, that's what he was trying to help. He was trying to help her to understand that it's not about the smartest person. And to what you're saying here about why people fall into groups is because the education system discourages us from standing out. If we raise our hand and it's wrong, then everybody like, dummy, you got that wrong. Then after a while, you might know the answer, but you scared to say it because you might
Wow.
be wrong. You scared what other people might say. So 50 Cent was just saying, I must be special because I'm not saying an answer that you don't know, so you can't say that I'm smarter than you. I'm just a dude that's bold enough to be like, hey, is it this? And I might be wrong sometime, but I ain't scared to raise my hand and say that I'm wrong. Some of the
Right.
stuff that I'm saying right now that you and I cover on our shows, a lot of our viewers suspect some of this stuff, but they ain't about to make no video on it.
Oh no. Right, because the cost is too great. I mean, if you think about what, even as bold as I am, I do a lot of times have second thoughts about, I wonder what my neighbors would think if they knew I felt this way. Not that they're nice or cordial with me, or like they're inviting me over for tea now, because they don't. But in
Mm-hmm.
my mind, I second guess, like, well, what if they know?
Mm-hmm.
Or even sometimes I'm out and I have people that say, "Hey, are you on YouTube?" And I'm like, "Yes." I'm hesitant because I'm like, I don't know how they're going to respond. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm doing what I do because I want people to
Mm-hmm.
see it. I want them to be like, oh, that's how she thinks. And so I shouldn't concern myself with what the group thinks, because it's like, why even start a channel if you not, the whole purpose is not to get the word out and share it. So even on this side of the aisle, well, I believe it does take a lot of bravery to be like, yes, I'm black and
Mm-hmm.
I'm a conservative. Um, there's always this little bit of, what is the group going to think? It doesn't last long, but I still do have, I second guess myself sometimes, even though despite the fact I'm like, wait a minute, I have truth on my side. Why do I need to be afraid?
There's a little subtlety, and hold me back up. I'll come back to that point what I was getting ready to say. But I was going to say, truth be told, my channel as it stands now, my channel was not supposed to be just me. My channel originally was supposed to be me and a friend of mine. Remember the Democrat that I told you that grew up across the street from me? He says, "What happened to you?" Blah blah blah. He's got different views from me. His name is Ray. And originally, Ray said, "Hey man, I got some microphones or whatever it is." He says, "Maybe you and I can do a podcast or whatever." Like, I don't know. We didn't know what name of the show would be. Rob and Ray or whatever it is. I'd be on the right, he'd be on the left. And at the very last minute, the day that I was supposed to drive over to his house to record the first podcast, he sent me a text and was like, "Hey, we have to cancel it." And I was like, okay. Keep in mind, he never gave me a date when we were going to reschedule it. His fear was so many people were getting canceled for having views and maybe losing their jobs or getting ridiculed in the public and all of this stuff, that he just really backed out, but he didn't have the heart to tell me. And there's a subtlety in that question that you asked about why people don't stand out, because in that very subtlety lies the Democrat Party's whole mantra. They believe, and you've seen this in Bernie Sanders' campaign. If you look around, you can Google this. In Bernie Sanders' campaign, it says, not me, us. The Democrats Party believe in communism. They believe in the group. They
Mm.
don't like individuality. And when you raise your hands, you are showing that you don't blend in with the group.
Right.
Communism is that. Communism is that silence waiting to defer to an authority. Raising your hand is like, nope, I don't really care what all of these people are thinking around me. I'm not even caring about you as the authority in the front of the room necessarily. I am an individual, and here is what I think. That is what most of people are nervous about. And they've been taught that through the school system, to keep your hand down.
Wow. So you didn't know this, but the way you answered that question and ended it literally takes us into my next question and kind of answers it. My next question literally was, why haven't Black people returned to the Republican Party? I think you just answered it.
It's happening. It's starting to happen. It's starting to happen a little bit more. And let me tell you who I give credit to. It's starting to happen a little bit more, and I give credit to Trump.
Right.
And let me tell you why. Because Republicans up until Trump had been the people who always want to be mannerable, and they always have to be the person who's quiet at the dinner table. If someone says that they voted for Obama, you shut up, stay quiet if you voted for anyone else. If someone says that they voted for Bill Clinton, any Democrat or whatever, it was pretty common knowledge that everyone could talk about that in public. But if you voted for a Republican or got Republican views, you were supposed to stay quiet until Trump. Trump came and was the first unapologetic Republican. Is like, I don't care, and I'll chew out the interviewer, the reporter, people talking to me. I'll tell people to put their hand down, whatever it is. I mean, for the first time, when that MAGA hat came out, I saw people walking out in public. Like, I mean, that's just.
No, I didn't see any of that, but I do own several of them. But my husband will not let us wear them out.
Oh, no. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've got one in the closet too. But I'm just saying, when I think it was the young, what do they call that group? They went all to Washington with Candace Owens.
The Black Leadership Summit.
Yeah, it was like a young summit. I forget what the A stood for. But anyway, yeah, there was a bunch of them out in public with these hats on. I'm like, Black Republicans, I've never seen that out in public. Never. As long as I when I first realized that I might even be a Republican, it was still a thing that I had to keep it quiet depending upon who was in my circle of friends who knew my views. But now it was like, young people was like, man, this is cool. And I credit that because Trump had always been kind of loosely affiliated with the Black community.
No, not kind of, very much associated. Like, you and I both are from New York.
Yeah.
So
that's what I'm saying. I mean, people forget that when Mike Tyson was on the outs with Don King, it was Donald Trump who became his promoter. People forget that. People forget that it was Donald Trump who brought Michael Jackson through Trump Towers and walked him around, and the whole hotel and all that kind of stuff. There was all sorts of examples of Trump in the Black community. And so when Trump came out as conservative, I mean, even in the rap songs, everyone know people compared themselves to Trump using all these metaphors. So when Trump started being a Republican, that was the first little idea of Blacks, like, maybe I'll vote Republican. And I've always kind of liked to do. And it was just kind of the same thing as when I said I knew I was a Republican but didn't know what it meant. I think in 2016, you had a little bit of that. You had a little bit of people voting because they liked Trump, but they didn't really know what it meant. They learned later to appreciate the policies, and then being in the culture, coming to the rallies, they started getting immersed in what conservatism is. And so now, actually, the reason why Democrats are in a panic is because those numbers are increasing of Blacks going back to the Republican Party. I saw some articles that were written to say that the Democrat Party is actually becoming wider and wider. Yeah. More minorities are going back to the Republican Party. It's not just Blacks, it's also Blacks, it's Latinos, it's Asians. A lot of people are leaving the Democrat Party. And so, I'm kind of excited about that. It's a catch-22. I'm excited about the fact that more of us are waking up, but I'm also nervous about the fact that because Democrats see this coming, they've escalated their plans. Like before, this whole thing about Marxism, that there will be the eventual overthrow of the government, eventually the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeois or whatever. They are starting to see we don't have time for eventually. They've escalated their stuff tenfold. So all of the stuff that we could never imagine, we're starting to see now.
Right.
It's so ironic that they call Trump a fascist, and I've seen more things clearly fascist under the Biden administration than ever before.
I think people use those terms, but they don't really know what they mean. They're just mimicking what they've heard said on CNN or some sort of liberal show. And so they start using these terms, but they don't know what they mean. And I would also agree with you where you said, more people are returning back to the Republican Party. We did see it a lot in 2016. We definitely saw it in 2020. We saw it here in Georgia in the gubernatorial race where Black men were just like, we're not voting for Stacey Abrams.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've seen it. I've seen the change in my own family, not all of us, but, at least I've been able to get my sister to be red pilled. And so I think the part that concerns me, because I am a Christian, when I see Black churches doubling down on leftist ideology versus champion ideals of Christianity, I don't want my audience to get confused. When I do shows like this where I'm talking heavily about politics, please believe that I'm not putting my biblical worldview aside for the sake of politics. Remember, my politics are informed by my biblical worldview. And so when people ask you the question, or how do you answer the question where they say, well, I don't like Republicans, and they'll say things like, well, I don't see them. What have Republicans ever done, for Black people? How do you answer that? Because I know how I answer it. And I'm like, that's the problem, but I'll reserve my answer because I want to hear yours. How do you answer, well, I hear what you're saying, but, I don't really like Republicans because they don't give you anything.
Mm-hmm. Let me back up. I'm going to come back to that question you just asked. I wanted to back you up on something that you said about Christianity for a second. Because
Okay.
when I was watching that Uncle Tom movie, I took a screenshot of something that most people, if they haven't watched the movie, they probably don't understand. Saul Alinsky is an organizer that the Democrat Party, people in the Democrat Party refer to a lot of times, organizing to push Marxist agenda, etc. He wrote this book called Rules for Radicals, and I want to read so that people can make sure that they're clear on no uncertain terms why you are on the right side of history. This is the foreword in that book, and you'll listen to who he dedicated his book to. It says, "Lest we forget, at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical from our legends, mythology, and history. And who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer." That's who he dedicated his book to.
Come on, Rob.
If that doesn't wake you up right there, have you ever, I'm going to come back to your question here, but have you ever seen that yin yang symbol?
Yes.
Okay. That yin yang symbol, I don't know if it's Korean or if it's Chinese symbol, but that symbol, for people who don't recall right offhand what I'm talking about, that's the symbol where it's black on one side, it's white on the other side. It's supposed to be a symbol of life. It represents duality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it represents duality. You have duality all around you. You've got left and right. You've got up and down. You've got dry and wet, right? You've got cold and hot. There's also male and female. There's all sorts of dualities. One of the things that people complain about in the United States all the time is they complain about the fact that we have a two-party system. I love the fact that we have a two-party system, because if we have a two-party system, and one of them believes in the unalienable rights that were given to you by God in our Declaration of Independence, of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and freedom. If one party believes in that, and you have another party that opposes that, it should be very clear the duality here of who is good and who is evil. If we had 13 parties, it'd be a little harder to figure out. But if you got two parties and one of them stands for God and one of them stands for freedom and life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and you have a party that's in opposition to you, why are you opposed to those things? It should be very clear, but a lot of people don't get that. Okay, so I love our two-party system, because if you're thinking, you can figure out which side you should be on.
Okay. Right. So, with that said, what would you say to individuals, particularly in the Black community, who claim to be followers of Christ? They're in church every Sunday, they're giving a huge percentage of their income to the church, yet they attend churches that they know are 100% lockstep in with the Democratic Party. What would you say to them in terms of, or do you have any thoughts on how these people are able to reconcile what they believe in terms of what they believe the Christian faith to be, but yet the way they live and function in the real world, they support policies that are the antithesis of that? How what would you say to those individuals that claim, like, yes, I'm a Christian, but yet they vote 100% with Democrats all of the time? What do you say to that?
Well, I'm one question behind you now, because I didn't answer your last question about.
Oh, well, go ahead. I apologize.
That's okay. I didn't answer your last question. You asked me, what do I say when people says, well, the Republicans don't give you anything?
Yes. Go ahead.
This is you're not supposed to. I know that.
That's my answer.
I know people, this is hard. This is hard for people to wrap their head around. But the whole point of God put us on this earth to be a multiplier. In order, if you know anything about math, in order for you to have a multiplier, you have to have, in order for you to multiply, you have to have something and a multiplicand, right? So we are here to be on this earth and then multiply to be the producers of things that we need. We're not here for someone to just give us those things and make that things for us easy. The life is in the entire experience of being able to go through those struggles and figure out things. Have you ever heard that expression before, that necessity is the mother of invention?
Yes, I have.
Right? If you look at the times when Blacks have had the most innovations, when they talking about gosh, I just blanked out on the one that did so much with the peanut.
Carver, George Washington Carver.
Right. So when you look at so much of the innovations, it came from a time that Blacks, you would think, wouldn't have come up with all those inventions because we struggle so much.
Right.
But necessity is the mother of invention. So to me, the more you actually, I'm trying to figure out the best way to put this without getting too deep. One of the things that someone showed me in the world of finance, and people don't grasp this, is I was taking a real estate course, and there's a person I respect a lot. And one of the things that he said is, he says, I'm going to explain something to you guys. He says, using cash is a sign of intellectual inadequacy. And I paused for a second and I was like, what? And he was like, here's something a lot of people don't realize. Most people don't want money. They just think they do. And I paused and I was like, I'm not sure I follow. And he drew this entire chart out of things that you would buy with money, like stocks and bonds and all these different investments, land and real estate. He had this chart, if you can picture, almost like a pinwheel. And he was like, these are things that you would buy. And he put money in the center. And he said, so if these are the things that you really want, and he says, what would you need money for? He said, if I just gave you those things, what would you want money for? Or another way to say this, if I gave you a stack of money and I set it in this room and I said, okay, there's $1 million, April. The catch is you can't leave this room. What value would the money have to you?
None.
It wouldn't have any value to you. So what you really are learning is the money in and of itself isn't the value. It's what you would do with that money on the other side is the value. So many people put too much power in the money and the opportunities that someone would give them without realizing the real power is in that knowledge of using your own brain to figure things out. You can get so many things done. Demon John, the owner of Fubo, wrote this book called The Power of Broke. And he was talking about that very same thing. He was like, most people don't realize in that struggle is where the genius comes out. Anyone can stroke a check. Women know this. I used to teach this in class. I used to say, have you ever tried to give a woman a gift of cash? What would she tell you? Sounds like you didn't put too much
thought
into
right.
that, right? So what we're telling is when people give you something, they're in a sense, indirectly, it's an insult to you because they don't believe you have the intellect yourself to be able to figure these things out. And so it's a difficult thing to explain to people right offhand, but there is power in being able to rely on yourself and coming together as a people. There's something called the wisdom of crowds. All these things that we think we need the government for, I got news for you. We've always done a way better job on our own of those very same things. The very same things. All of this stuff, raising capital, all this stuff that we think we need governments for, people have been doing that stuff on GoFundMe and all these different things, crowdsourcing or whatever it is. We don't need the government for most of the things that we believe. I don't look for anyone, any government to give me anything. I look for a government to get out of my way so that I can be myself. That's the reason why we minimize government, because we don't want government to be the inhibitor. I don't know.
That's good.
I sat down with Dr. Alveda King to answer your last question you said about Christians. We were talking about the fact that I said, let me ask you, how do pastors reconcile? And I was talking about at the time, Pastor Warnock. I said, how does a pastor reconcile being a pastor and at the same time being for abortion? I've never understood that. How can that be? And she said, she used an analogy with Barack Obama. She says that Barack Obama said in one of his speeches, he said that he was pro-life, but he is running as president for the Democrat Party, and therefore he has to be pro-choice. And so she was saying that indirectly to say that it could very well be that he already knows that he is pro-life, but because of the position, because of the affiliation of the people surrounding him, that he is choosing pro-choice. And those are things that those people are going to have to hold an accounting for their own life. I don't really know how to answer that. But other than the fact that to me, that is more of showing the cracks and inconsistencies in the Democrat Party. There's so many places where the Democrat Party is inconsistent.
Right.
That's why I started off saying before about Democrat parties making you feel bad about being wealthy, all the while you're seeing them pursuing wealth on their own, right? Calling something global warming one day, and then when someone shoots that down, then they'll call it climate change to rebrand it the next day. Saying that anyone can identify as anything they want, and then when a Republican, a white man identifies himself as a black female, then all of a sudden you say, no, you can't identify. Oh, why not? Because there's no consistency in the Democrat Party. It's actually a challenge. It's more challenging to be a conservative than it is to be a Democrat. Because a Democrat, you don't have to be consistent. You can be wishy-washy from day to day. The challenge with being conservative is you actually have to give your opinions. You have to give, I don't even say opinions. You actually have to give your positions based on some fact.
Right.
And you have to be consistent with it. It requires what Milton Friedman used to call a self-denying ordinance. I remember that phrase, a self-denying ordinance. You can see things that you want. This is probably leading towards like affirmative action. You can see things all that you want, But even though you want it, you have to think in the long run, is that good for me? What does that mean as a ramification of me taking that thing? That's a
Right.
self-denying ordinance, being able to recognize, yeah, I can see that I want it, but in the long run, it is not good for me. Everybody wants free speech, right? But the problem is everyone wants only the speech that they agree with.
Right.
And they don't realize that's not what freedom of speech was designed for. Freedom of speech was designed to protect the very thing that offends you.
Mm.
That's a self-denying ordinance.
Got you. Okay. Well, we can take a little bit of time since you brought up affirmative action. The results for affirmative action, they do indicate that affirmative action is a failure. Now, I know that might be shocking for a lot of my audience to hear because they're like, well, what do you mean? But you did a video on the subject where you mentioned how affirmative action was supposed to improve education, employment, and other opportunities, if I'm correct. But can you recap for us what affirmative action is and give me your most honest opinion on it?
Okay, affirmative action is supposed to be something that improves employment opportunities. It's supposed to improve opportunities and increase fairness
Right.
throughout the workplace or whatever, any area. Um, but it doesn't,
Mm.
and it doesn't for a variety of different reasons. I know I covered that in the show, but I'll give you a real world example using myself. I'm an international speaker. I teach finance and teach real estate investing. I, for most of my career, for a better part of 20 years, have been the only Black speaker. The times when I wasn't the only Black speaker, there was only one other person. I've got a great rapport with all of the instructors. I'm surrounded by highly paid white guys all the time. We got a great rapport, friends. They're like extended family to me. Um, I used to be a second slot speaker. We used to hold events where there were two speakers. I was
Mhm.
a second slot speaker, which was kind of subservient to the first one. It was typical for that first speaker, when they finished their set, they would leave the room. One day I looked up though, and I was doing my presentation. And I looked up, and the first speaker was still in the room, and I was like, this guy Steve is still here. And I said maybe he left something, and I didn't think anything about it. I'm still talking to the audience. The next day, same thing. I looked up, Steve was still in the room, and I was like, wonder why he's in the room. And then all of a sudden it hit me. What the office used to do is, after we did every presentation, is they would email all of the data out to show how many we sold, what the statistics were, etc. And I realized Steve was seeing those. He was getting those reports and realizing I was crushing him in the numbers. But he had never seen me speak because he was always accustomed to leaving the room. So
Right.
this time he decided to stay and see what I was saying. And when I finished speaking, he walked up to me and he said, "You're good." And I said, "I appreciate that." And he says, "I don't really tell very many people that." He says, "You're good." I'm mentioning this in the context of affirmative action because I earned Steve's respect that day, because he saw me speak, he saw my numbers, and he was like, that dude is good. When I got promoted, which I eventually did, from second slot speaker to first slot speaker, I took the position that Steve hadn't had, even though he had been there for over a decade. I was only there for about 6 months. Steve never complained to me, not one time, because he saw the numbers, he saw me speak. It was my performance. It had nothing to do with an aesthetic. It was my performance. He totally understood, and everyone around me understand. Now let's add affirmative action in the mix and see how this would change. Let's just say all of a sudden that the company's value system was, we're going to fly Rob out to the most lucrative markets. Even though he's surrounded by these world-class speakers who are knowledgeable, we're going to give these markets to Rob. Now, Rob can't sell. As a matter of fact, his numbers are down. He doesn't sell very much. The complaints are pretty high when Rob speaks because he doesn't know his stuff. There's a lot of refunds. What would instantly happen is there will be a lot of talk among the white instructors saying, I don't believe they got this guy here in that slot. I'm trying to feed my family. They got me over here in Podunk, whatever town. Rob's out here in Los Angeles speaking, and he can't even sell. And we all know why he's here, right? Immediately, there would be racial tension
Right.
because of affirmative action, right? I'm just there for my skin color, not for my performance. So immediately, there would be racial tension. Second thing is because of the fact that these people cannot provide for their families, because they see as unfairness now, their morale goes down. They don't feel like doing their job anymore. Their morale is down. So now we got two negative results so far from this one policy, right? Racial tension, low morale. Oh, and did I mention the fact that Rob isn't selling, which means the company is also losing money because I was never qualified to begin with. So do you see what affirmative action actually does? Is it's not a meritocracy. It's not based on my performance. It is totally based on some aesthetic that has absolutely nothing to do with the job. So in that episode that you're talking about, I was going through some examples of Thomas Sowell talking about the fact that, he sees Black students that are in the 95% percentile. They're smarter than 95% of the other students in the nation, and that's great. But the problem is, if you move someone who is in the 95 percentile and you put them in a school with 99 percentiles, or they're smarter than 99% of the people in the nation, all of a sudden what you've just done is you've set that Black student up for failure. You've set them up for failure because they can't keep up with the pace of those students. It doesn't mean that that Black student is a failure because they're smarter than 95% of the people in the nation. If you had placed them in the appropriate schools, they would have been a success. They would have done great. But now that you've placed them for aesthetic reasons, you've got that person flunking out. You've got that person who just took out a student loan under this, guys, and saddled debt onto them, all for what? For aesthetics. Not to mention the racial tension that you've created in the schools and the universities, because all of those other students know you don't even belong here. You can't keep up.
Right.
So it doesn't improve any of those things that affirmative action sets out to improve.
Right. I've actually have queued up another real life example that you demonstrated in your video that just made me chuckle so hard. I'm gonna go ahead and share that with the audience briefly. This video is just to demonstrate. I'm gonna let you engage with it after I show it. The failure of affirmative action and how we're actually still living through this failure today. So let me take a moment to share that with you guys.
Follow this logic.
The governor and I, and we were all doing a tour of the library here and talking about the significance of the passage of time, right? The significance of the passage of time. So when you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time in terms of what we need to do to lay these wires, what we need to do to create these jobs. And there is such great significance to the passage of time when we think about a day in the life of our children.
So I shared that because okay, first, before we provide gracious critique to the significance of the passage of time, right? Before we do that, I want you to first express, do you really think that she, in that moment, thought she was saying something profound and prolific and just kind of lost it? Or do you really just, because part of my audience is going to say, you're being really critical and you're not being fair. This is a woman who went to Howard, attended law school. She was, a very, very successful attorney. Why is it that you're saying that she's unqualified to sit in the second highest office of the land? She's not a dumb person, and you're trying to paint her out to be like she's just ignorant. What would you say to that argument?
No, I believe she really does think that she's making a difference. She does believe that she's saying something deep. And that's the scary part. She does think that she's saying something deep. She's been sitting with some people who probably her advisors and just saying, hey, these are the things that sell here. And that goes back to the thing that I said earlier about communism, going along with the group versus having enough sense to realize something on your own and say, no, that doesn't. It doesn't. Disagreeing with someone. She doesn't realize that she hasn't provided any value whatsoever in what she's just talked about. And whatever that tour was that she was talking about through the museum, wherever she was, is providing no value whatsoever. She always speaks in circular references where she repeats the same thing she just said like 2 or 3 times. She does it on a regular basis. So I know she has to be aware of it. There's enough feedback online of people saying that very thing. I've got another one that's even worse than that. I challenge people. I posted it and I challenged people. I said, I guarantee you can't finish this video. I can't remember what she was saying, but she was saying something at the end of being unburdened by things that might have been, or something like that. But
I can imagine what can be and be unburdened by what has been. You know?
What can be unburdened by what has been.
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 What we can see, what we believe can be unburdened by what has been.
What can be unburdened by what has been.
What can be unburdened by what has been.
What can be unburdened by what has been.
Who we can be unburdened by who we have been.
What can be unburdened by what has been.
Where we can be unburdened by where we have been and unburdened by where we are right now.
What can be unburdened by what has been.
What can be unburdened by what has been.
What can be unburdened by what has been. What could be unburdened by what had been.
What can be unburdened by what has 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 been.
Unburdened by what has been, believing in what can be.
What can be.
She says it like 15, 20 times. Every presentation is the exact same thing.
Right. So in light of that, though, can you help bring it all home to help people understand, one, it's obvious that affirmative action was used in order to place her in this position. President Joe Biden made it very clear that he was going to be hiring a woman and that it was going to be somebody Black. And now the significance of the passage of time is significant because time has passed, and you can now see that her in this role has been an abject failure. Bring the connection to why if this is what affirmative action yields, it's bad. Or I'll say this, how would you answer the person that says, okay, well, I don't think it's a failure if the person is qualified? I would argue that you can't even say that because it's not that Kamala Harris is not that smart. Obviously, you don't go to law school, you don't do well on the LSAT, get into law school, and then dumb people don't pass the bar, right? So I'm not trying to walk away to tell people, oh, she's just dumb and she's not smart. But she is mismatched for the current role that she is in. Engage with what I just said and put your additional commentary on it to help people understand that affirmative action is not the equal playing field that they led us to believe that it would be.
Right. It's not an equal playing field. It's actually the phrase that you just used, mismatched, is actually the problem because it's not an equal playing field. It's unequal because she is not equipped for that position. And it is very obvious to everyone who ever sees her speak. The same thing applies with the press secretary. I mean, when Jen Psaki was the press secretary, I thought she was bad. But gosh, when they brought the new press secretary in, I was like, what the heck? It was obvious that just because of the fact that she was a Black lesbian. And I'm like, right, that is the problem, is that there is a mismatch. And so that's really the danger here, is that you are placing people who are unqualified for aesthetic reasons and it'll all come back to bite you. That's why I just used the example of what would happen in the speaker's case if I was that person that allowed me to be placed in the position simply because of aesthetics. All of the drama that would ensue, there would probably be lawsuits from other instructors with the company because prove that Rob Lett actually can produce, and none of the statistics would be there. There would be so much drama that came as a result. There have been death in countries where people have had racial uprising, all because of so-called affirmative action. It is a clear mismatch. It is a clear mismatch. And it's dangerous. It's just dangerous. It doesn't, but the big thing is it doesn't even do what it set out to do, to improve the opportunities. It doesn't.
Right. So actually, I'm glad you brought that up because in following your content, you did a video on affirmative action that it blew me away because in the video you discussed how affirmative action, how it functioned in Malaysia. Can you briefly just tell us a little bit about kind of recap the disastrous effects that it had and what they ended up doing as a result of saying, okay, this is not working out like we thought?
Honestly, I don't recall that specific story. That was one that I don't recall because I did the research for that show at the time, but I don't recall how that ended up. I think if I remember correctly, that is one where they were trying to. The Chinese were actually outperforming them in school.
That's what it was. The Chinese were outperforming the Malaysians, and the Malaysians, the Chinese were the minority.
Right.
They were the minority, but through their own efforts, they were working hard. So what the Malaysians decided to do was say, well, this is not fair. They're taking all of our slots in school. They're doing all of these things and they're outperforming us. Even though we're the majority, we want to implement some sort of affirmative action so that we can still gain access to these schools and these positions and things like that. And I think ultimately, I'm trying to remember the outcome.
I think they left the country. I think all of the educated Chinese left the country, if I'm remembering correctly.
Right, because they couldn't right.
When we think of affirmative action, see, this is the reason why it's always important to see things on a national level too, because when we think of affirmative action, we always have been told or been taught that it is to benefit a minority, people that are in a minority. But in Malaysia, it proves that affirmative action is actually a preferential treatment policy because they were not the minority. The Malaysians were actually the majority who were jealous of the minority, who was more educated. And so when the Chinese started outperforming them in schools, Malaysians instituted all these new policies to throw bricks in their road. They were like, okay, the new language now is going to be Malay. They did that because they knew the Chinese didn't speak Malay, anything to throw roadblocks in their way. And so the downside of how it affected their country negatively, again, I'm just trying to remember the downside, how it affected their country negatively is it didn't mean that those Chinese weren't still educated. They were educated and now realized that they were in a country where the people weren't there to foster their success. And so they left. And so a lot of the medicine and all of the different things, the skills that their country needed, they didn't have.
So it started to break down the fabric of the society because now healthcare is suffering, engineering is suffering, and then it fostered kind of like a little civil war between these two groups, and people ended up down. It was just disastrous.
Right. And then they ended up doing away with it.
Right.
When you look at a lot of those places where they've instituted affirmative action, you'll find later that they've done away with it because it doesn't work. And they just quietly do away with it because they don't want to tell anyone publicly that it really doesn't work. It causes more problems behind the scenes, racial tension, in some cases, even to the extreme of death. Right.
Well, for whatever reason, we see that the current Biden administration is a huge fan of these affirmative action hires, from the Health and Human Services guy, from the press secretary, from, the vice president of the United States. Like we've just got, then you've got the transportation secretary, like everyone in key positions of prominence and importance are all there for some other reason other than their meritocracy or their skill set. And now we're seeing that the Build Back Better campaign of President Biden's presidency has actually been a disaster, and we're not really building back anything better. But what I'd like you to do is, can you provide your political commentary on the current state of Biden's Build Back Better plan? Do you think it's working? Like, is it me? Am I just being overly critical and saying none of this is working, or is that the actual reality that we're living through right now?
No, this is a big mess. I posted on Facebook the other day a meme, and I had it said Biden paper towels, and it was a meme. And I said, "Do you need something messed up real quick?" And I said, "Try these paper towels." And I said, "Do you currently have a 1% inflation rate? Currently have a 1% inflation rate? I keep saying right. Do you currently have a 1% inflation rate? Use these Biden paper towels, and boom, just like that, you got 9.1% inflation rate, right? Do you currently have 51,000 people illegally crossing your border? Use these Biden paper towels, and boom, 189,000, just like that, are crossing your border, right? Every single thing this man touches has been totally ruined and been messed up. I've never seen a screw up so fast of everything, from inflation to rent to groceries. I mean, when he first came in, I think it was like several months after the office, I think there was this thing where like our fuel pipeline was hijacked. And then like a week later, it was like the meat was hijacked. It was like every single thing has been a total disaster. No, Build Back Better is horrible. I did a short. It's I don't remember what my statistics were in that video, but I said, a lot of people have been trying to convince us that Trump has been the worst president in history. But what's very telling is if you listen to whenever Biden is in a jam, they always say, this is the worst inflation rate in 40 years. So notice what just happened. It skipped over the Trump administration years era, and it goes back to a time preceding Trump. And it's always that with Joe Biden. So it can't be that Trump is the worst president, because every time they mention this list of worst, they always skip over the Trump era to mention some other time, right? Biden has had the worst inflation rates in like 40 years. He has the worst grocery prices, the worst rent prices. I can't count how many times the Federal Reserves have had rate hikes in about 2.5 years. No, I don't think it's Build Back Better. He's always been a socialist that has been marketed to us as a centrist. And that's what people don't understand, because most people don't study socialism anyway.
Very true.
I did, and I don't know if you want to. Well, I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole with Biden. But I was going to say I'll keep it short to say this. I did a show that was called "The Movie You've Never Seen But Should Have," and I believe Biden right now, what he is doing, the worst thing of all, is he is laying the seeds for a race war. And I hate to say it that way, and people are gonna say, "Oh, why would you say that?" Because I've been in barbershops. I'm sure you've been in hair salons. I've never been around a bunch of brothers just saying, "Man, KKK is keeping me from doing this. The KKK skinheads keep me doing that." How in the world could you go to Howard University and say that the greatest threat to America is white supremacy? I've never been around a bunch of people complaining to me about white supremacy.
For the record, not to cut you off, but my audience may or may not know that, but President Biden did give the commencement speech at this year's Howard University's graduating class. And he actually said that in the commencement speech, that the greatest threat to America today is white supremacy. He said it, and now I see, I'll let you continue, but just that was at an HBCU's graduation.
Exactly. And so the reason why I made the show, I won't go too deep into that show, we'll stay on other things, but the reason why I made that show was called "The Movie You've Never Seen But Should Have." What inspired me to make the show is I had done another show talking about the left's global assault on freedom, because we're so tied in just focusing on the United States. We don't realize that this is a pattern all across the world, of leftists and them wreaking havoc everywhere they go. But I was looking for a clip to put into my new show about the Klan. And I couldn't find this clip. And all of a sudden, somewhere along the line, I was searching through YouTube, and I stumbled across this movie that I had heard of, but I had never seen. And the movie was called The Birth of a Nation. The movie is 108 years old. And someone was doing a quick little summary of the movie. And because I never watched it, I just figured, oh, let me see what he says the movie is about. And he said something in there about, just so you can understand what the premise of the movie, Birth of a Nation is talking about during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, all of a sudden you had Confederates who obviously, you can tell what their views on blacks were because they had them as slaves, but now Abraham Lincoln sends black Union soldiers with weapons to get the South in order. That didn't set well with too many of the whites in town. So the name of that movie, Birth of a Nation, is really talking about the birth of the black nation. And the movie is told from the Confederates' perspective of how this was a threat to them, okay? But when I watched this summary of the movie, one of the things that came out in the movie, most people haven't seen this movie. One, because it's 108 years old. Two, it's 3 hours and 15 minutes long. Three, it's a silent movie. Most people ain't interested in none of that. But one of the things that came out is one of the clips, it showed that whites felt that they were being oppressed and were in the minority. They were made to feel that there was black supremacy. And when I saw the context that they were trying to present in the movie of being black supremacy and that whites were in the minority, it made me pause right on that clip. And I said, holy crap, I've seen this strategy before. I thought immediately about the Los Angeles Times wrote about Larry Elder when he ran for governor of California, and they called him the black face of white supremacy. And I said, is this a strategy? And I said, because someone, and I sat back and thought about reality for a second, and I said, right now, white people are being made to feel more and more frustrated because someone is going out of their way to push CRT and Black History and 1619 Project and all of this stuff. And you shut up if you're white and blah, blah, blah. And they're going out of their way to make whites feel very, very frustrated and pretend that they're in the minority, even though they're not. And so I paused and said, for what purpose? And that's when I watched the movie. And for those who don't know this, the Klan was actually dead around the time that movie had come out. But it was a Democrat president, Woodrow Wilson, who showed that movie, Birth of a Nation, in the White House. And that began the resurgence of the KKK. But the last thing that ended that movie is it showed the KKK kind of taking their town back. One of the last things they did to stop this black supremacy was they disarmed all blacks of weapons. And it was the same time when I was watching this, it was the same week that Joe Biden had given the State of the Union address when he said, ban assault weapons and ban them now. And I said, holy smoke, this is all happening too fast, because all of these things are occurring at the same time. It is a white president who is going out of his way to get the black vice president in your face, the black press secretary in your face, to bail out the black basketball player in Russia. All of these things they're putting out there to let we're black, and then putting out this white supremacy is the enemy. And I'm like, they're playing chess, because the Democrat Party was the original slave owners. And a lot of black people don't realize you're being teed up to go backwards, because whites are still the majority. And they're trying to get them frustrated enough to want to bring back those slavery days. And blacks don't realize it. You're voting for the very party that is going somewhere with this agenda. This is not new. This is not new. When I told you earlier that some of my friends called me a sellout, I was like, dude, the funny thing is, you don't realize I'm more gangster than you are, if you want to put it in street terms. Because let me ask you a question. If somebody hung your family, if somebody stole from your family, how long do you give them before you forgive? 2 years? 3 years?
Right.
5 years? Guess what? The Democrat Party never forgets. They never forgive. When Stone Mountain opened up in Georgia 100 years to the day, they opened that park 100 years to the day of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. 100 years they ain't forgot. And the reason I'm telling you I'm more gangster than you is because if you are willing to vote for the Democrat Party, then you're telling me there's a certain amount of time, even though they've hung our family, that I'm willing to let bygones be bygones. And I'm telling you, I don't.
Wow. So let me ask you this. So as we conclude our discussion for today, what is the main thing that you want to leave my audience with as we head into the 2024 election season as it relates to helping people understand the issues of the day in light of leftism versus conservatism, living under a Democratic president and seeing the country pretty much just going down the toilet very, very fast? What is it that you'd like to leave with my audience as we head into this next election season?
Wow, that's a good one.
It's broad, but
the thing that I would tell you is to lean on. I think the biggest thing that I could say is what I just read earlier about that rules for radicals, and I gave that quote from Lucifer. If that is the premise, and it is, Saul Alinsky, if you were to study socialism and Marxism specifically, if you were to study BLM, just the people that they hang around, this BLM, if you were to study, all of these things that the left are doing right now, getting you to question male or female, or those are only two genders, putting men in women's prisons. If you were to analyze all of those things and you know in your heart that those things are not the truth, you have to ask yourself at some point, at the end of the day, if you could look back in history and say, where did you side? Did you side with truth or did you side with a lie? You've got to know that there are not 72 genders. You've got to know those sorts of things, right? You have to know that you can't allow a child to pick their own sex. You've got to know that you shouldn't have children in surgery to change their sex. So those are things that are really at stake right now in terms of our freedom. Are we going to continue down this road of what we've seen in just 2.5 years? Inflation, groceries, rent, all of these different things are getting worse in a short period of time. You need to realize that Marxism, do some study on Marxism. And I suggest people read books on Marxism, not doing it online, because the internet is centralized, right? Eventually the government is going to come to wanting to take control of the internet. Read some books about Marxism so that you can really get away from Google's editing and all this kind of stuff. And then you'll understand really what the entire principle is behind the Democrat Party. So I think what I would leave people with is forget about the politicians. Take the politicians out, because I know people get caught up in Trump's rhetoric or whoever you want to insert there. And you might feel a certain way about Biden. Take them out and just go down to the principles that they believe in both parties. One of them is clearly talking about the rights that you were born with from God. And the other one is the opposite. Tell me where you want to be if I just gave you that description.
That's good. That's good. I am so grateful that you've chosen to spend this time with me today. I need you to tell everyone, Rob, your YouTube channel name, how they can find you on YouTube, and how they can also find you on Rumble or any other social media outlet that's important to you. Go ahead and tell the people.
Okay, they can go to just put my name as ROB, last name LETT. So you can put Rob Lett or the Rob Lett Show. So it's just youtube.com/Rob Lett. Same thing on Rumble. If you put in the Rob Lett Show or Rob Lett, I'm on Twitter at Rob the Speaker, and I think I'm on Facebook, Rob the Speaker. Sometimes it pops up there. Either way, you'll be able to see my face on there. But those are mainly, I'm old school, so I'm not on a whole bunch of things. I'm on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Rumble.
That's a lot. Most old people are like, listen, I'm not on the YouTube yet. But if You're on YouTube and Rumble. You're way ahead of the game. I'm appreciative of the time that you've spent with me today. Thank you so much for sharing your political commentary with my audience. And you guys, until next time, grace and peace.